Big Shaq walks into his own luxury store and gets kicked out by a manager who doesn't recognize him. But Big Shaq isn't just a name, he's a storm waiting to break. When a viral video explodes, the city watches as power, prejudice, and reputation collide on a public stage. As the world closes in, can Shaq turn humiliation into redemption, or will the system break even a giant? In a world where silence is complicity, Big Shaq is done staying quiet. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of downtown, where steel towers stretch toward restless clouds, Shaquille O'Neal strolled down the bustling avenue, his presence commanding double takes, camera flashes, and whispers. Yet inside his mind, there was a calm, a peace hard-earned through years of spotlight, heartbreak, and triumph. Today wasn't about cameras or crowds. It was about stepping quietly into the newest jewel of his business empire, a high-end boutique tucked between glossy storefronts and glitzy restaurants. He wanted to see it like a regular man. No entourage, no VIP entrance, just Shaquille, the human being. As he approached the boutique, the sleek glass doors reflected his towering frame. He grinned faintly, amused at how people still called him Big Shaq, even though deep down he saw himself as just Shaquille. He pushed open the door and entered, the soft chime announcing his arrival. The boutique was a portrait of quiet luxury, marble floors, gold fixtures, leather seats, and it smelled faintly of cedar and leather, expensive and cold. Behind the counter stood Derek Slade. He was in his mid-30s, with a razor-sharp haircut, perfectly pressed shirt, and a look in his eye that sized up people within seconds. Derek's gaze swept over Shaq, pausing at the hoodie, the sneakers, the skin. No glimmer of recognition touched his face. To Derek, this was just another big black man wandering into a store he likely couldn't afford. "Can I help you?" Derek's voice cut through the soft jazz playing overhead, sharp and dismissive. His eyes narrowed, the way someone's eyes narrow when they're used to being in control of every inch of their turf. Shaq smiled politely, a deep warmth radiating in his eyes. As he glanced around, hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Just browsing," Shaq said, his voice low and steady, the kind that made people pause, but not Derek. Derek's lips tightened. A glance to his right, a subtle signal to the sales associates, and suddenly there was movement behind the counter, whispers, glances. Shaq could feel the air shift. It was a shift he knew well. As he walked slowly past a display of custom Italian jackets, Shaq heard the unmistakable sound of Derek's polished shoes following behind. "Sir, some of our pieces are quite exclusive. If you're just here to look around, maybe you could." Derek's voice trailed into a sharp smile, the kind dressed in politeness but lined with disdain. Shaq turned slightly, his 7-foot frame casting a shadow over the manager. "That's so," he murmured, amusement flickering in his eyes. He could have pulled out his phone right then, shown Derek his name on the ownership papers, his face in the marketing campaigns, his signature in the contracts, but something inside him stilled his hand. Outside the glass, people paused, peering in. Some recognized him, tapping phones, nudging friends. But inside, Derek's world was airtight, his kingdom undisturbed. "Perhaps you'd like to check out one of the outlets downtown," Derek offered with a practiced edge. Shaq felt the burn of the moment, the tension curling under his skin. His whole life people had told him he was too big, too loud, too different. But never in this way. Never in a place that bore his name above the door. A woman near the handbags coughed uncomfortably. A younger employee, Leah, no older than 21, glanced at Shaq with wide eyes, a flicker of recognition dawning on her face. But Derek's steel gaze kept her silent. Shaq took one slow, measured breath. His heart was steady, his face calm, but in his chest, there was an old ache. An ache from battles fought and scars carried. "Didn't catch your name," Shaq said smoothly. "Derek Slade," the manager snapped, straightening. "I'm the general manager here." Shaq gave a thoughtful nod. "You do good work, Derek. The place looks sharp." His eyes swept across the boutique, noting every detail, the gleaming counters, the soft lighting, the curated elegance. It was everything he'd imagined when he'd signed the lease, written the checks, designed the vision. But at this moment it wasn't his. Not really. As Shaq turned toward the door, Leah's voice broke the hush. "Wait, aren't you?" she began, but Derek's quick glare shut her down. Shaq offered her a brief, kind smile and shook his head slightly. Outside, the streetlights blinked on in the fading daylight. Shaq stepped into the cooling air, the sounds of the city wrapping around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from his mother Lucille, from Madara, from Shawnee. He ignored them for now. Across the street, a small crowd gathered, murmuring in recognition. Someone raised a phone. Shaq raised a hand in a casual wave, but his face was thoughtful, almost somber. He stood for a long moment, gazing back at the store. Inside, Derek stood proudly at the counter, arms folded, eyes triumphant. Shaq's gaze didn't harden, didn't darken. If anything, there was sadness in it. A weariness from knowing that no matter how high you climb, some walls remain. He turned, walking slowly down the sidewalk, his massive frame blending into the golden haze of evening. A father passing by with his daughter stopped, staring up at him in awe. Shaq bent slightly, offered the girl a fist bump, and smiled. As he walked on, his mind spun, not with anger, not with plans for revenge, but with something deeper. Justice wasn't about striking back. It was about exposing the truth. He would return, not with lawyers or fists, but with something more powerful. Tomorrow the world would know what Derek Slade had missed, and Shaq the giant among strangers would no longer be a stranger in his own house. The sun hung high over the city, its light streaming through the boutique's wide glass windows, painting soft golden streaks across the polished floor. Shaq had only meant to glance around, to admire how the vision he'd shaped on paper had come to life. The tasteful elegance, the flawless design, the atmosphere meant to make customers feel both luxurious and welcome. But the warmth he'd imagined had not greeted him. Instead, he stood surrounded by cold glances and tense air, his presence treated like an intrusion rather than a homecoming. Derek Slade stepped forward, his polished shoes making precise, clipped sounds on the marble as he approached. His face was pulled tight, the polite smile sharpened at the edges like a blade. "Sir," Derek began, voice low but firm, "we've had some issues with people hanging around without buying. Just making sure you're aware this is a high-end establishment." Shaq tilted his head, a gentle curiosity touching his expression. He had dropped hints already, small, casual remarks about the decor he'd chosen, the marketing campaigns he'd overseen, but they had slid right off Derek, as if he were armored against any possibility that this man before him could be more than what his eyes saw. Around them, the store hummed in an awkward tension. A couple near the sunglasses rack froze mid-conversation, stealing glances toward the unfolding scene. A man by the leather jackets shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Shaq and Derek. An older woman clutched her handbag just a little tighter as she moved toward the door. Even Leah, the young sales associate, stood with her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her blouse, her eyes flickering between loyalty to her boss and the faint growing recognition of the man they were quietly dismissing. Shaq let out a soft breath, slow and controlled, a lifetime of restraint pressed into that small exhale. He had learned long ago that being big, being black, being famous, none of it exempted him from the sting of being reduced to something small. His voice, when it came, was gentle, even warm. "It's a beautiful place you've got here," he said, his eyes sweeping once again over the store. "The details, the perfect execution. Feels like home, you know?" But Derek only tightened his smile, mistaking Shaq's calm for defiance. "I'm going to have to ask you to make your selection soon, sir, or we may need to free up the space for paying customers." The words were crisp, practiced, and unmistakably final. Shaq's eyes flicked briefly to Leah, who opened her mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to explain, but Derek's glance snapped her silent. Shaq felt it then, deep in his chest, the old familiar ache. It wasn't the words that cut the deepest. It was the quiet certainty in Derek's eyes, the unshakable belief that he was right to push him out, that this man didn't belong. Outside, a few onlookers pressed closer to the windows, their phones half raised. They didn't know the full story, didn't understand the tension lacing the air inside, but they sensed something, that unmistakable pulse of a moment, just before it cracks wide open. Shaq straightened, not in anger, not in defiance, but with a quiet grace that filled the space Derek had tried to shrink. He glanced around once more, his heart a strange tangle of disappointment and clarity. He had faced down roaring crowds, crushing defeats, staggering victories. But this small, ordinary moment cut sharper than he expected. "Appreciate the hospitality," Shaq murmured, turning toward the door. As he walked, the soft sounds of the boutique seemed to hush, as though even the walls were watching. Derek crossed his arms, victorious in his silence, while the others looked on, some curious, some embarrassed, some just uneasy. At the door, Shaq paused for a heartbeat, letting the weight of the moment settle into the room. Without looking back, he pushed the door open, stepping into the warm daylight, the sounds of the city rushing up to greet him. The fresh air hit his face, and for a long moment, Shaq just stood there, feeling the ache twist in his chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Lucille, a check-in from Shawnee, a message from Mara. He closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself in the quiet rhythm of their names. Across the street, a young man stopped, his eyes lighting up in recognition. "Yo, Big Shaq," he called, lifting his phone for a quick photo. Shaq offered a small wave, a faint smile, but his mind was already turning. This wasn't the first time he had been dismissed, overlooked, or reduced to something less than his name. But this time was different. This wasn't a restaurant or an airport lounge, or a hotel lobby. This was his store, his vision, his investment, his own creation turned stranger to him. And that, more than anything Derek had said, lodged deep under his skin. He walked slowly down the block, the city unfolding around him in familiar rhythm. Cars rumbling past, people laughing on cafe patios, dogs barking at the end of taut leashes. But inside his chest, a storm had begun to gather. Not a storm of fists or fury, but a storm of resolve. Shaq had always believed that justice was not in the shout, but in the weight of truth. And tomorrow, he promised himself, the truth would walk back through that boutique's door, not to tear it down, but to remind it, and everyone inside, exactly whose name was written on the walls. Behind him, the boutique's windows gleamed in the sunlight, a beautiful cage that had failed to hold his dignity. Ahead of him, the city stretched wide, full of possibility and challenge. Shaq squared his shoulders, tucked his hands into his pockets, and kept walking, each step steady, each breath measured, each thought sharpening into purpose. Because the quietest insult often leaves the loudest echo. And Big Shaq had always known how to make an echo shake the walls. Shaq's home was a peaceful fortress on the edge of the city, its walls lined with trophies, family photos, and the quiet echoes of a life spent straddling two worlds, the blinding lights of fame, and the deeper, quieter ties of family. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the hills, as Shaq pulled into the driveway, the weight of the day pressing heavy across his broad shoulders. Inside, Lucille sat in the kitchen, stirring a pot of gumbo, the smell filling the house with warmth and memory. Mara, headphones around her neck, lounged on the couch, tapping through her phone, while Shawnee sat near the window, eyes distant, phone resting on her knee. As Shaq stepped through the door, Lucille turned, her eyes softening as they landed on him, though her instinct sharpened in an instant. "You all right, baby?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with knowing. Shaq managed a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He dropped his keys into the bowl on the counter and sat down heavily at the table, elbows resting on his knees, head hanging for a breath. Miara pulled off her headphones, sensing the shift in the room, and Shawnee's gaze snapped into focus. Shaq drew in a slow breath. "Went by the boutique today," he began, his voice low, measured, but underneath, the simmer of something unspoken rippled through. "New manager Derek Slade. Didn't know me. Didn't care to." Lucille's hand paused mid-stir, her face tightening. "What happened?" she asked, though her tone already carried the weight of suspicion. Shaq explained it in pieces. The cold shoulder, the whispered suspicions, the subtle pushing out that carried the sting of a slap without the sound. He kept his voice even, but the edges of his words trembled with the rawness of it. Shawnee's hands curled around her phone, knuckles pale. "Shaq, that's your store," she said sharply, disbelief cutting through. "He humiliated you in your own house." Miara's brow furrowed, her fingers twitching nervously on the couch arm. "Did anyone see? Did anyone record it?" Shaq gave a half shrug. Didn't think about it. Didn't matter much at the time. But even as he spoke, a buzzing on Mara's phone drew all their eyes. "Wait," Miara murmured, her thumb flicking across the screen, face draining pale. "Dad, someone did film it." Within seconds, she was showing him a shaky clip posted online, a bystander's phone video, barely 30 seconds long, but enough to capture the tension, Derek's dismissive posture, and Shaq's quiet retreat. The caption was vague, the comments speculative. Some manager flexing on a random dude. One comment read, "Looks bad. Store needs to check its staff." Another chimed in, Dude's huge. Wonder who he is. Shaq stared at the screen. A strange sensation stirring in his chest. The sharp bite of insult mingled with the eerie detachment of watching yourself become a story without a name. Lucille moved to his side, pressing a firm, grounding hand to his shoulder. "Baby, you can't let this slide," she said softly, her eyes steady and fierce. "You've worked too hard, given too much to let some fool like that throw dirt on your name." Shawnee nodded, her voice taut with conviction. "This isn't just about you, Shaq. It's about all the people watching, all the kids following your example. You let this go. What does it tell them?" Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly, his mind spiraling through decades of lessons learned in locker rooms, boardrooms, and on the street. He was no stranger to injustice, no stranger to carrying burdens heavier than championship rings. But this was personal in a way that cut to the bone. Outside, the world hummed on, unaware that the quiet storm gathering in Shaq's living room was about to ripple far beyond its walls. Meanwhile, online, the clip gained momentum. Shares doubled by the hour. Comments stacked into the hundreds. The mystery of the man in the video fueled curiosity. Speculation ran wild. A wealthy customer, a local athlete, a stranger wronged in public. But no one yet had pieced together that it was Big Shaq himself. Back inside, Mira paced the floor, phone in hand. "Dad, this is going viral. What do you want to do?" Shaq was silent a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. His mind churned through options, press statements, legal action, public appearances, but none of it sat right. He wasn't interested in vengeance or spectacle. What he wanted was something deeper, something that struck at the heart of what had gone wrong. "Tomorrow," he murmured finally, his voice gaining weight. "I go back." Lucille's brows lifted, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "What you planning, Shaquille?" He looked up at her, and there, at last, the full force of his quiet resolve shone through. "Not fists, not lawyers," he said evenly. "I want to look that man in the eye, on my terms, and I want the world to see the truth." Shawnee's eyes softened, pride glinting through her worry. "You always did know how to shake the ground without stomping." The evening stretched on, the house bathed in a hush filled with preparation and thought. Outside, the city darkened into night, but inside, the O'Neal household pulsed with anticipation. On social media, the clip continued its march, inching closer to recognition. A few sports fans began making connections, dropping hints in the comment threads. News outlets quietly picked up the story, curious about the identity of the towering figure who had exited the boutique with such graceful restraint. In his room, Shaq stood by the window, gazing out at the lights of the city. His reflection loomed large in the glass, but his eyes were distant, turned inward. This was no longer just about a single insult, or a single man. It was about the quiet, grinding machinery of assumption, the way dignity was chipped away in public and private, the way even giants could be made to feel small. And tomorrow, when he stepped through those boutique doors again, he would carry not just his own name, but the weight of every invisible person who had ever been pushed aside. The world was watching now, even if they didn't yet know it was him. And Big Shaq was ready to remind them that sometimes the loudest justice arrives on quiet feet. The night had settled over the city in a hush of neon glow and murmuring streets, the air thick with summer warmth, as Shaq walked alone beneath the streetlights. His towering figure moved through the city with a grace that belied his size, shoulders slightly bowed, hands buried deep in his pockets, eyes fixed not on the sidewalks or storefronts but on some distant point beyond them. The world he'd poured his heart into, the charities, the clinics, the community centers pulsed quietly around him, yet tonight it all felt edged with a sharpness he hadn't noticed before, as if the city itself was whispering a truth he hadn't been ready to hear. With each block, his mind wandered back. He remembered college gyms in towns where his teammates were cheered, but his name was met with silence. He remembered road trips where he was asked to use the side entrance, hotels where keys were handed to others first, awards ceremonies where smiles tightened as his name was called. Even at the height of his NBA glory, when his face was on magazine covers and his name on sneakers, there were moments when the doors didn't open quite as fast, the eyes didn't quite meet his, the assumptions still slipped in like cold drafts under locked doors. He crossed into the old neighborhoods where his foundation had built playgrounds and youth centers, where murals of his face smiled down over cracked pavement, and laughter still rang from basketball courts late into the night. Here people knew him not as a superstar or a businessman, but as Shaquille, the kid who'd made it out, the man who hadn't forgotten them. A few people called out as he passed, voices bright with affection, but tonight he only lifted a hand in quiet acknowledgement, his mind wrapped tight in thought. As he moved through the heart of the city, he passed under a giant billboard advertising his boutique. The same boutique where, just hours ago, his presence had been treated like a threat. The image above him smiled down with flawless confidence. A giant, a legend, a man who belonged. And yet, below, on the street, Shaq knew that belonging had never been something granted to him freely. It had been fought for, earned over and over, and still in rooms like Derek Slade's, still denied without a second glance. He stopped at a small park, resting on a bench beneath an old oak tree, the hush of the city settling around him like a thin blanket. His fingers tapped absently against his knee, and his mind turned over the choices ahead. He could call his lawyers, release a statement, crush the boutique with bad press, and watch Derek's career unravel overnight. He could stage a press conference, demand accountability, remind the world who he was, but none of it sat right. None of it reached deep enough to touch the core of what burned in his chest. Shaq had always believed in something bigger than noise. He'd believed in showing up, in being present, in letting the weight of his life, his work, his name, speak into spaces where words could not reach. He knew that sometimes the loudest voices were the ones never raised, the quiet refusal to be diminished, the calm reclaiming of what was yours. From the corner of his eye, Shaq noticed a father and son on the far side of the park, the boy dribbling a worn-out basketball under the dim glow of a streetlight. The father's voice carried softly, offering encouragement, and the boy's laughter rang out in short bursts as he practiced crossovers, his small frame weaving and darting with determination. For a moment, Shaq simply watched, the sight stirring something old and familiar in his chest, the memory of Lucille on the sidelines of his own youth, the quiet urging, the unshakable belief that he could be more. He rose, stretching his long frame, and continued his walk. His phone buzzed intermittently, news alerts, text messages, missed calls from sponsors and friends. But he ignored them, knowing the noise would wait. The city whispered to him in flashes. The mural of a civil rights leader splashed across a brick wall, the couple clasping hands across a cafe table, the taxi driver who gave him a hesitant wave of recognition. It reminded him that change was never in the grand gesture alone, but in the steady push, the relentless showing up. As midnight neared, Shaq found himself at the edge of the river that cut through the city, the water glimmering under the moonlight. He leaned against the railing, the cool metal grounding his thoughts. For a long while he let himself feel it all. The sting of the day's insult, the ache of old wounds, the pull of responsibility, and then slowly, clarity settled in. Tomorrow he would walk back through the boutique doors. He would stand in the space that bore his mark, not with anger or spectacle, but with the quiet, unyielding presence that had carried him through every challenge of his life. He would remind Derek Slade, and everyone watching, that dignity was not something to be granted, or revoked by the whims of small men. It was a birthright, and Shaq intended to claim it without lifting a single angry hand. As he pushed away from the railing, his phone lit up once more. This time, Miara's name flashed on the screen. He answered, his deep voice softening as he listened to her chatter, her worry, her fierce belief in him. Lucille's voice came next in the background, then Shawnee's measured calm. The voices of his family wrapped around him like armor, steadying his heart, reminding him who he was, and why he stood where he stood. As the city drifted towards sleep, Shaq turned toward home, his steps measured, his shoulders squared. Tomorrow would bring a storm, but it would not be one of raised voices, or slammed doors. It would be a storm of presence, of truth laid bare, of injustice met with quiet, devastating clarity. And Shaq, as always, would walk straight into it, unshaken, unbroken, the whispered storm at the heart of it all. The morning broke with a cool breeze rolling through the city, brushing against the towering glass windows of the boutique like the first warning of a coming storm. Inside, Derek Slade's voice echoed sharply across the marble floors, his commands clipped and impatient as he barked orders at the staff. Fix that display, and someone polish the front counter. We have VIP clients today, Derek snapped, adjusting his tie in a mirror. The boutique gleamed, but Derek's nerves crackled just beneath his polished surface. What Derek didn't know was that outside, on the sidewalk still wet with morning dew, Shaq was already approaching, his frame wrapped in a simple sweatshirt and jeans, a quiet calm in his eyes. He had walked this same path yesterday as just another customer, but today he returned as something larger, a symbol, a statement, a reckoning. His steps were steady, unhurried, but his mind was sharp, calculating the next moves in a game Derek didn't even realize he was playing. Overnight, Shaq had worked the phones. A handful of trusted journalists had been tipped off, quietly invited to the boutique that morning. A few community leaders, people whose names carried weight in city circles, had been alerted as well. No press releases, no public calls for outrage, just a quiet ripple spreading through the right channels, the kind of ripple that always turns into a wave when the moment arrives. As Shaq neared the boutique, he caught sight of a few familiar faces, mingling near the entrance. Not fans, but reporters dressed down to blend in, activists he'd worked with on local initiatives, neighborhood leaders, whose eyes sparkled with curiosity. They greeted him with subtle nods, a flicker of understanding passing between them. No one needed to explain what was about to happen. Inside, Derek paced, glancing at the rising number of customers trickling through the doors. A small crowd had formed outside, drawn by whispers, by curiosity, by the pull of something electric in the air. Derek, oblivious, saw only a busy day ahead, more bodies to manage, more sales to push. Shaq stepped through the door. For a moment, the boutique hushed, the soft jazz playing overhead, seeming to fade beneath the quiet shift of attention. Derek's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You again," he muttered, pushing away from the counter, his footsteps sharp across the floor. Shaq offered a calm smile, his hands casually resting in his pockets. "Morning, Derek," he said, his voice smooth as silk, carrying no hint of yesterday's slight. Around them, the staff froze mid-motion, eyes darting between the two men. Leah, the young associate, edged closer to the register, her face pale with nervous anticipation. Derek squared his shoulders, forcing a tight smile. "Sir, I thought we made it clear yesterday. If you're not here to purchase something, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." His tone was louder now, sharp enough to slice through the murmuring customers. Cameras lifted, subtle at first, then bolder. Phones captured the moment as it unfolded, the tension twisting tighter with each passing second. Shaq's eyes swept slowly across the store. He saw the familiar details he had once obsessed over, the hand-picked decor, the carefully curated shelves, the brand that bore his fingerprints in every corner. But today he saw more. The anxious employees, the watching customers, the weight of expectation hanging in the air. He turned his gaze back to Derek, letting a beat of silence stretch long enough to pull the crowd closer. "Funny thing about ownership," Shaq said softly, his words carrying just enough for those nearby to catch. "Sometimes people forget what it really looks like." From the corner, a voice piped up, one of the reporters, playing the part of a curious shopper. "Hey, aren't you Shaquille O'Neal?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of recognition through the room. Heads swiveled, conversations stilled, and Derek's face drained of color. "Wait," Leah murmured, her voice breaking with sudden realization. You're Big Shaq?" Derek stumbled, his mouth working to form words that didn't come. The polished charm cracked, the carefully built image splintering beneath the weight of public reckoning. I didn't know," he began, but Shaq raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "This isn't about me," Shaq said calmly, turning to the crowd now gathering around. His voice was steady, even, but beneath the calm was a quiet force that pulled everyone closer. "This is about how easy it is to look at someone and think you know who they are, to judge without asking, to decide they don't belong without learning their story." The cameras lifted higher now, the crowd pressing in. Derek stood frozen, his authority draining away with each word. Leah lowered her eyes, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Shaq continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, touching each face in turn. "We build businesses, we build brands, we build dreams. And sometimes the last people to be welcomed into those dreams are the ones who created them. That's not just a problem in this store. That's a problem in this city, in this country, in this moment." He turned back to Derek, who stood trembling at the counter, fingers gripping the edge, as if it could hold him up. "I'm not here for an apology," Shaq said quietly. "I'm here to remind you, and everyone here, that respect isn't about the suit you wear or the title you carry. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching." Outside, more onlookers had gathered, drawn by the swell of voices, the flicker of cameras, the sense of something important unfolding. Inside, the boutique held its breath, the air crackling with a tension that was part confrontation, part catharsis. For Derek, there was no smooth exit, no clever pivot. The narrative had slipped from his grasp, and all that remained was the truth, laid bare and undeniable. For Shaq there was no need for raised voices or harsh words. The quiet weight of presence had done what no argument could. As the crowd slowly parted to let Shaq pass, the murmurs followed him, whispers of recognition, of respect, of reckoning. Outside he paused for a moment, breathing in the cool morning air, the sun breaking through the clouds above. He felt the storm behind him, not of destruction, but of change, and he knew the day was only just beginning. Tomorrow the headlines would tell their version. But today, the boutique had witnessed something no camera could fully capture. A giant walking into a storm, and the storm folding in quiet surrender. The boutique had never felt so small. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, bouncing off polished marble floors, gleaming handbags, and mirrored walls. But none of that shimmer touched Derek Slade as he stood frozen at the center of the storm. The low hum of voices had grown into a charged current, cameras tilted forward, customers standing half still between racks of designer coats and glass counters. And in the center of it all, calm as a still lake but towering like a mountain, stood Shaquille O'Neal. Derek's throat worked to push out words that stuck like sandpaper. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize. I mean, you should have said something." His voice, usually smooth and commanding, cracked under the weight of realization. His hands fumbled with the cuff of his shirt, as if smoothing the fabric might iron out the humiliation crawling up his spine. Shaq lifted a hand, palm open, his voice soft but unmistakably firm. "Derek, this isn't about whether you knew my name." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with a few taps brought up an email, turning the screen toward the man who had tried to eject him twice. Derek's eyes skimmed the signature at the bottom. Shaquille O'Neal, owner, and his face drained to a pale waxy shade. A hush rippled outward through the boutique. Like a stone dropped in still water, customers lowered their phones, some blinking in surprise, some trading glances as they realized the quiet man they'd seen dismissed was the giant in the ads, the face on the billboard, the legend behind the brand they coveted. Shaq let the silence settle, his gaze sweeping over Derek, over the staff, over the crowd that had thickened inside and outside the store. His hands stayed loose at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his expression free of anger. But the weight of his presence pressed into every corner of the boutique, anchoring the room in a truth no one could unsee. "I didn't come here for a confrontation," Shaq began, his voice carrying without force, each word measured and clear. "I came here yesterday because I wanted to see the space we built, the space I built, from the ground up. I wanted to walk in like anyone else, without cameras or headlines, just a man proud of what his team has accomplished." He paused, letting his words find their place in the room. Derek's mouth moved as if to interrupt, but nothing came out. Shaq turned slightly, addressing the onlookers now. The people pressed into corners, peering between mannequins, their phones half lowered as they leaned in to listen. "But what happened instead," Shaq continued, "was a reminder of how easily we box people in, how fast we decide who belongs and who doesn't, just by looking at them. No matter how high you climb, no matter what you've given or built, sometimes you're still asked to prove you belong." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, recognition, sympathy, quiet shame. Leah, the young associate who had hesitated the day before, stood near the register with her eyes downcast, her fingers twisted nervously at her waist. Derek straightened, pasting on a brittle smile. "Mr. O'Neal, please understand. It was just a misunderstanding. We pride ourselves on excellent service." Shaq's eyes flicked to him, calm but cutting. "Respect isn't something you turn on when you find out someone's name, Derek," he said, his voice gentle but edged with steel. "It's something you offer every person who walks through that door." Outside, the glass windows were ringed with faces, the sidewalk alive with murmuring bystanders, the unmistakable glow of phones lifted high. Inside, the boutique felt as though it had shifted on its foundations, the rules rewritten in the space of a few minutes. Shaq moved forward a step, looking not at Derek now but at the room itself. "We talk a lot about success in this country," he said. "We celebrate achievement. We worship winners. We tell kids to chase their dreams. But what are we building if, at the top of all that, we still look at a man and decide he's worth less because of the color of his skin, because of the clothes he wears, because he doesn't fit the picture you expected?" Derek's hands clenched at his sides, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, as his carefully curated authority slipped away, moment by moment. The staff behind him exchanged uneasy glances. Leah took a hesitant step forward, her lips parting as if to speak, but Shaq offered a small, subtle shake of his head, not out of anger, but mercy. He wasn't here to humiliate the innocent. He drew in a slow breath, grounding himself as he had so many times before, at the free throw line, on the business stage, in the private battles no cameras had ever caught. "I didn't need to come back today," Shaq said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, "but I wanted to. Because sometimes you don't fix a problem by walking away. Sometimes you fix it by standing in it, by making people see what they've been blind to." He looked at Derek one last time, and in that gaze was no hatred. Only clarity, a man holding a mirror up to another and giving him a chance to face what stared back. The door behind Shaq swung open as corporate representatives arrived, their crisp suits marking them as the next chapter in the unfolding reckoning. Shaq stepped aside, offering them a polite nod as he moved toward the entrance, the crowd parting with a rustle of awe and respect. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. As Shaq emerged, applause broke softly, almost hesitant at first, then swelling as people clapped, not for the celebrity, but for the moment, for the man who had claimed his space without a shout, who had unmasked not just a manager, but a mindset. Shaq paused at the edge of the crowd, drawing in the crisp air, his chest lifting as if letting go of something heavy. He glanced back once, just once, toward the boutique, and the man who still stood inside, pale and unsteady in the aftermath of Then, with the calm of a man at peace, Shaq turned and walked forward into the day, his steps measured, his heart steady, the giant unmasked but unbowed. The boutique buzzed with a strange kind of energy, a mix of uneasy anticipation and thinly masked discomfort. Derek Slade stood stiff at the counter, his fingers drumming nervously on the polished surface, as the hush that had fallen after Shaq's quiet departure lingered in the air. Outside, the sidewalk pulsed with murmurs and camera flashes, but inside, the real storm was just beginning to stir. Corporate had arrived. Two figures in tailored suits swept through the entrance, their clipped steps echoing sharply across the marble floor. Evelyn Carrington, the regional director, led the way, her sharp bob and cool gray eyes slicing through the tension like a blade. Beside her was Paul Granger, a VP from headquarters, his jaw clenched, expression hard. They didn't need to announce why they were there. The weight of the viral video, the tidal wave of public outrage, and the swirl of customer complaints that had followed, made their purpose clear. Derek's face brightened with a desperate smile. As they approached, "Evelyn, Paul, this isn't what it looks like," he began, voice riding the edge between charm and panic. "There's been a misunderstanding." But Evelyn's hand cut the air like a knife. "Save it, Derek," she said crisply, her voice low but lethal. "We've seen the footage. We've seen the news cycle eating its way through our brand's reputation like wildfire. And we've seen the internal reports from staff." Her gaze flicked to Leah standing silently near the register, eyes wide and uncertain. Paul folded his arms, the muscle in his jaw flexing as he measured Derek with an expression that spoke of buried patience fraying at the seams. "Do you understand what you've done, Derek? Do you have any idea how hard it's going to be to clean up this mess?" The store had begun to fill with customers again, drawn by curiosity, by gossip, by the magnetic pull of a scandal unfolding in real time. Some murmured to each other, while others hovered near displays, pretending to browse but tilting their ears toward the confrontation. The cameras from outside pressed closer to the windows, eager to catch every frame of a downfall in motion. Derek straightened, his hands lifting in a placating gesture, his voice sliding into the silky tones that had served him so well, for so long. "Look, I was just protecting the store's image. We have a certain clientele, a certain standard, and I couldn't have known." A voice from the side cut him off sharply. "You couldn't have known, or you didn't want to know." It came from an older man near the leather goods, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You didn't ask his name. You didn't check his story. You just saw a black man in a hoodie and decided he didn't belong." Another voice chimed in, a woman by the handbags, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "He isn't the only one you've treated like that, Derek. I've been coming here for years, and I've seen you turn people away with that same polite sneer." Leah stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "He's right. Customers have complained before. And she hesitated, glancing nervously at Derek before pushing on. "We were too afraid to say anything." Derek's face drained of color, the charm slipping like a cracked mask. "Now hold on. Let's not turn this into something it's not. But Evelyn's voice sliced clean through the noise. "Oh, it's exactly what it is, Derek." Her eyes never wavered. "And the fallout is just beginning." Shaq, standing quietly just outside the glass doors, watched the scene unfold. His large hands tucked into his pockets, a faint, thoughtful expression on his face. He had no need to step in, no desire to twist the knife. The truth was doing that all on its own. He caught sight of Lucille and Shawnee across the street, standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes on him. Mira leaned forward slightly, her phone in hand, watching her father with the fierce pride of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Shaq gave them the smallest nod, a signal that everything was unfolding just as it should. Inside, Derek's words grew thinner, the crowd's murmurs louder. Evelyn and Paul conferred briefly in low voices, before turning back, the decision etched clearly across their faces. "Effective immediately." "Derek," Evelyn said, her tone ironclad, "you're suspended pending formal review. We'll handle the announcement, and I suggest you leave the premises before this becomes an even bigger scene." For a moment, Derek simply stood there, his mouth slightly open, the flush of authority draining from his skin. His hands fell to his sides, the helpless gesture of a man who had built his pedestal on sand. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the boutique that had been his domain, and what met his gaze were not sympathetic glances or whispered support, but the hard, unyielding weight of public consequence. Shaq watched as Derek stepped out from behind the counter, his stride slower, his posture no longer sharp with control. The crowd parted in a restless ripple, giving him space but no comfort. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and the air thrummed with the unmistakable electricity of a power shift. For Shaq, there was no triumph in this moment, only a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't needed to shout, to rage, or to force anyone's hand. He had simply let the truth rise to the surface, and it had done what truth always does when given the space to breathe. It had changed the story. As Derek passed through the boutique doors, his eyes flicked up briefly, landing on Shaq's towering figure. For a flicker of a second, the two men locked eyes, one humbled, one resolute, and in that glance was a lifetime of lessons Derek would carry whether he wanted them or not. Shaq inclined his head slightly, not in gloating, but in acknowledgement. And as Derek walked away, shoulders hunched, the crowd shifted again, its focus sweeping back toward the man who had redefined the room without ever raising his voice. Inside the boutique, Evelyn turned to the staff, her voice brisk but not unkind. "We've got work to do," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's start by making sure this place becomes the kind of store we can be proud of." Leah straightened, the tension easing slightly from her shoulders, and a murmur of quiet determination stirred among the staff. Outside, Shaq breathed in the crisp air, feeling the weight on his chest lift slightly. This wasn't the end, not of the work, not of the fight, but it was a crack in the armor, a shift in the weather, a reminder that sometimes the proudest fall not from a push but from the slow crumble of the pedestal they built beneath themselves. As the morning stretched forward and the city pulsed on, Shaq turned from the boutique with measured steps, his heart steady, his purpose clear, leaving behind a world slightly changed and walking toward whatever waited next. The sunlight poured through the boutique's glass walls, casting long stripes of gold across the polished floors, as the crowd swelled inside and spilled onto the sidewalk. Phones hovered in the air like tiny lanterns, recordings streaming, capturing a moment that had shifted from scandal to something deeper. But in the center of the room, it was not the cameras that held the crowd still. It was Shaquille O'Neal standing tall yet steady, his voice carrying without force, his presence filling every inch of the space. Shaq glanced around, his eyes sweeping over faces both familiar and new, resting for a heartbeat on Lucille, who stood near the back with her arms crossed, her face proud and calm. Beside her, Mara leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide, her fingers curling nervously at the hem of her shirt. Shawnee stood just behind them, her hand resting lightly on Lucille's shoulder, a quiet anchor in the storm of the morning. Shaq's voice cut through the murmurs, not loud, not demanding, just clear, unwavering. "I didn't plan on today being a lesson," he began, his gaze flicking toward the cameras, then back to the crowd. "But sometimes life decides for you." There was a shifting, a soft stir in the room, as people leaned in, the usual noise of the boutique, the tap of heels, the rustle of shopping bags, the clink of glass, all fading into a kind of reverent hush. Shaq drew in a breath, not to steady himself, but to make space for what he needed to say. "I've been blessed," Shaq continued, his voice low, thoughtful. I've stood on courts in front of thousands. I've had my name in lights. I've signed deals, built businesses, made headlines, but none of that ever stopped me from walking into places and being sized up before I even opened my mouth. None of it erased the moments when I was treated like I didn't belong. Derek, now standing at the side near the counter, shifted uncomfortably. His hands were clasped in front of him, his once smooth posture sagging with the weight of public unraveling. His eyes darted to the door where two corporate security officers waited. Not aggressive, not rough, just present, ready. His arrogance, the shield he'd worn like armor, had thinned to something brittle, almost see-through. Shaq's gaze didn't linger on Derek. It swept over the employees, the customers, the community leaders who had come quietly to witness, the young staffers who stood wide-eyed by the register. His words landed like slow, sure beats of a drum. We talk a lot about success in this country, about climbing ladders, breaking ceilings, but success doesn't mean you stop facing walls. And the people who build those walls aren't always loud, aren't always waving flags. Sometimes they're smiling at you over a counter, asking if you can afford to be here. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, a shared, collective shift, as heads nodded, as eyes softened with recognition. Lucille's eyes glistened as she watched her son, her chin lifting slightly with each word, the years of struggle and sacrifice reflected in her stillness. "I'm not here today for revenge," Shaq said, his voice dipping into something softer, almost tender. "I'm here because power, real power, isn't about tearing people down. It's about lifting truth up where it can't be ignored. It's about choosing what you stand for, even when nobody's forcing you to choose." Outside, the street had filled with more onlookers, the sunlight glinting off camera lenses, off storefronts, off the windows of the boutique now transformed into an unlikely stage. Marawa reached out, fingers wrapping around Lucille's arm, her young face glowing with both awe and the complicated joy of watching a father turn pain into purpose. Shaq paused for a moment, drawing in the breath of the room, letting the quiet stretch just enough to settle into the bones. Then, with the faintest smile, he added, "Change doesn't come from shouting people down. It comes from making sure they can't pretend they didn't see." Derek flinched as Evelyn, the regional director, approached with a quiet firmness, her words almost inaudible over the soft hum of the crowd. Derek's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he offered a faint nod, then turned stiffly, walking toward the door under the quiet escort of the corporate officers. His eyes flicked up, meeting Shaq's for the briefest second, a look mixed with bitterness, regret, and something more fragile, maybe even recognition. Shaq inclined his head, not with triumph, but with quiet acknowledgement. There was no need for further words between them. The moment had spoken loud enough. As Derek disappeared through the door, the crowd shifted again, a ripple of release, of closure. Shaq turned back to the room, his hands spreading slightly, his shoulders loosening, as the weight lifted. "We've got work to do," he said, his voice warming now, the hint of a grin flickering at the corners of his mouth. "Not just here, everywhere." The employees gathered near the counter, exchanged glances, some smiling faintly, some blinking back tears. Leah, her shoulders still tense, gave a tentative nod, her fingers brushing against the register as if grounding herself. Shawnee stepped forward through the crowd, Lucille and Miara at her side. She reached out, touching Shaq's arm with a quiet squeeze, her eyes shining with pride. Lucille offered no words, just a slow nod, her hand resting on Shaq's back, the touch of a mother who understood every scar her son carried. Miara looked up at her father, her eyes wide, a soft smile breaking through her nerves. "You were amazing," she whispered, "just for him. Just between them." Shaq smiled, lowering his head to press a kiss to her forehead, his massive arms briefly wrapping her into a fierce, protective hug. Then he straightened, his eyes sweeping the room one last time. Outside, the crowd began to thin, the day reclaiming its ordinary rhythm. Inside, the boutique was no longer just a store. It was a reminder, a marker of change, a space where a quiet storm had passed through and left the walls stronger for it. As Shaq moved toward the door, Lucille and Shawnee beside him, Mira clutching his hand, the boutique settled into a new kind of hush. Not the tense, brittle quiet of a place trying to hide its shame, but the soft, expectant silence of a place ready to begin again. Because justice, Shaq knew as he stepped into the sunlight, was never about revenge. It was always, in the end, about revealing hearts, and in that, today they had all been seen. The days that followed were heavy with fallout. Headlines blared from newsstands and smartphone screens alike. Clips of Shaq's calm, commanding stand in the boutique looping across social media feeds, late-night talk shows, and community town halls. People debated, shared, argued, but beneath the noise, something deeper stirred. The boutique had become more than a store. It had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting a conversation the city could no longer ignore. For Derek Slade, the world shrank quickly. Stripped of his position, the polished charm that had once opened doors for him now rang hollow. He found himself ducking cameras, avoiding old acquaintances, and rehearsing apologies that soured on his tongue the moment they left his mouth. At first he railed against it privately, bitter, defensive, convinced he had been misunderstood. But somewhere between the sleepless nights and the sinking realization that his reputation was in tatters, a quieter voice began to rise within him, whispering a truth he had long refused to face. So on a cool Thursday afternoon, Derek stood at the edge of a modest basketball court on the west side of the city, his fingers knotting and unknotting nervously at his sides. Across the cracked asphalt, Shaq moved easily among a group of teenagers, his booming laugh filling the air as he showed one lanky kid how to pivot and another how to sink a free throw. Derek hadn't expected the sight to sting, but it did. Here was the man he had tried to dismiss, standing under the open sky, surrounded not by wealth or status, but by something much harder to manufacture: trust, respect, community. Shaq caught sight of him and lifted a hand in casual acknowledgement, finishing his round of encouragement before walking toward the fence. "Derek," he said simply, the weight of his voice wrapping around the name, neither cold nor warm, just real. Derek cleared his throat, adjusting his collar even though no one here was watching him like they used to. "Shaq," he started, voice hoarse, "I owe you an apology, a real one." For a beat, Shaq said nothing, his large frame still, his eyes steady. Derek swallowed hard, and pressed on. "I was wrong. About you. About how I treated you. About what I assume. I've been wrong more times than I can count. And people have been telling me for years, but I didn't hear it until now. And I don't know if words are enough. But," his voice cracked, and to his surprise, his chest tightened. "I am sorry, truly." The quiet between them was alive with tension. But it wasn't the brittle tension of confrontation. It was the sharp, aching tension of possibility. Shaq rubbed a hand over his jaw, eyes thoughtful. "You know," he said finally, his voice low, "it's not the apology people remember. It's what you do after." Derek nodded quickly. "Anything. I mean that." Shaq tilted his head, considering. "There's a youth program I fund," he said, his tone measured. "We run mentorships, career coaching, financial literacy workshops. All the things kids don't get in school. They could use someone to help with logistics, fundraising, hands-on work." His gaze sharpened slightly. "But it's not a photo op, Derek. It's not a redemption tour. It's rolling up your sleeves, showing up when no one's watching, listening more than you talk." Derek opened his mouth, then closed it, then let out a breath that sounded a little like surrender. "Okay," he murmured. "Okay." Shaq watched him a moment longer, as if weighing not just his words, but the shape of his heart, the cracks and the hollowness, and the possibility of something new. "I don't know if you change," Shaq said softly. "Honestly, I don't know if you can, but I know you've been handed a choice. That's more than most people get." The conversation could have ended there, neatly wrapped, but life rarely ties itself up in bows. Derek lingered a second longer, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Why are you giving me this chance?" he asked quietly. Shaq's face softened, just slightly, the faintest tug of a smile at one corner of his mouth. "Because someone once gave me one," he said, "and because justice isn't about burning people down. It's about pulling people up, when they're willing." The basketball bounced once against the fence, rolling lazily toward them. Derek bent instinctively, scooping it up with an awkwardness that made Shaq chuckle under his breath. With a flick of his wrist, Shaq motioned for Derek to follow him back toward the court, and together they walked into the sunlight, the shouts and laughter of the kids rising around them like music. Lucille watched from a bench nearby, her arms folded, but her eyes soft. Shawnee at her side, with Mayura leaning forward, phone in hand, capturing the moment quietly. They weren't looking for a miracle. They weren't naive, but they knew what it meant when a man chose the harder road, and they knew the strength it took to offer that road to someone who had stumbled. Whether Derek would take the chance seriously, whether he would rise or fall again, was a question no one could yet answer. But Shaq's integrity was unmistakable. Unshaken. He had turned humiliation into a teachable moment, confrontation into a path forward, anger into a challenge not to destroy but to rebuild. As the afternoon light shifted into gold, and the first hints of evening crept into the sky, the court remained alive with motion and noise. Shaq clapped a hand on Derek's shoulder as they moved among the kids, his voice rising in laughter, in correction, in praise. And somewhere deep in that restless city, a new kind of story was quietly beginning to unfold, one not of ruin, but maybe, just maybe, of redemption. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long golden rays over the boutique's entrance. Where once the doors had been a threshold of exclusion, now they were flung wide open, a steady stream of laughter and conversation spilling onto the busy sidewalk. Shaq stood just outside, his massive frame a calm, grounding presence in the flurry of activity. Kids from the neighborhood darted around him, sneakers slapping against the concrete, their faces lit with wide grins as they jostled to get closer. "Big Shaq," one boy shouted, thrusting a scuffed basketball forward, eyes gleaming with hope. Shaq took the ball, his huge hands dwarfing it, and spun it casually on one finger before flipping it back, making the boys squeal with laughter. Around them, other kids clutched sneakers, t-shirts, even scraps of paper, eager for a signature or a moment of attention. Shaq crouched down, Sharpie in hand, his face lighting up with every story they spilled about the game they'd just won, the school project they were proud of, the dream they nursed in their hearts but hadn't yet dared to say aloud. Lucille watched from nearby, seated on a bench with Shawnee and Myra, flanking her, the three of them quietly taking in the scene. Lucille's eyes softened with every glimpse of her son, pride shimmering just beneath the surface. She had raised him to be more than just tall or famous, or rich. She had raised him to be good, and here he was, not just reclaiming a storefront but transforming it into something bigger, something lasting. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where once Derek's tight grip had smothered authenticity with curated exclusivity, now the space buzzed with the energy of change. Evelyn, the regional director, stood at the counter, speaking with Leah and the other young staffers, charting new plans, mentorship programs, community partnerships, internships for underprivileged youth who had once walked past these gleaming windows, thinking they didn't belong. The staff moved with purpose, their faces alight with the rare satisfaction of meaningful work. Shaq rose to his feet as the kids circled tighter, their voices rising in a chorus of excitement. He clapped his hands together, his voice carrying with effortless command. All right, listen up." The laughter faded into eager quiet. Shaq's eyes swept over them, his smile softening into something more reflective. "I see all of you," he said, his voice warm but edged with that quiet authority only life could teach. "And I want you to know, you belong in places like this. You belong in boardrooms, on courts, in classrooms, behind the counters and in front of them. Don't let anybody tell you different." There was a hush, a charged stillness as the kids hung on his words. Even the adults nearby, neighbors, shop owners, curious passers-by, leaned in, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Shaq's gaze swept to Lucille, then to Shawnee and Memara, his chest lifting with a deep breath. "I didn't get here alone," he continued, his voice gentler now. "I had people who pushed me, who believed in me, who made sure I knew my worth even when the world didn't. And it's my turn now, our turn to do the same for you." Behind him the boutique windows gleamed, but it was no longer just a place to buy luxury. It was a place where opportunity waited, where doors swung open instead of closing shut. Shaq had already announced his latest initiative that morning, a paid internship program designed to bring in local youth, offering them hands-on experience in everything from retail management to marketing, customer service to entrepreneurship. The boutique would no longer be just a monument to commerce. It would be a bridge. As the kids buzzed with excitement, Shaq leaned down, signing a pair of sneakers held out by a shy girl near the back. "Keep pushing, all right?" he told her softly. "Keep pushing, no matter what they say." She nodded, eyes wide, and darted back into the crowd. Across the street, news crews began to gather, but Shaq barely spared them a glance. His focus remained on the circle around him, the ones who mattered most. This wasn't about repairing his image, or reclaiming his pride. It was about planting something that would last long after the cameras stopped rolling. Inside the boutique, Evelyn smiled faintly as she watched from the window, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes softened by the sight. Leah and the team moved between customers with renewed purpose, their laughter and ease transforming the once tense space into something light, something alive. Derek's absence still hung in the air, not like a wound, but like a shadow slowly receding. Whether he would find his way toward redemption remained unknown, but the store had already begun its next chapter without him. As the late afternoon melted into evening, the city hummed with its familiar rhythm, taxis weaving through traffic, vendors calling out from food carts, the distant thrum of music spilling from open windows. But on this corner, outside this boutique, a different kind of music rose, the laughter of children, the murmur of hopeful conversations, the soft shuffle of new beginnings taking root. Shaq straightened, glancing once more toward his family, his eyes meeting Lucille's with a quiet gratitude that needed no words. Mira waved from the bench, her phone still raised, capturing a final photo. Shadi gave him a small, knowing smile, the kind built on years of shared triumphs and trials. And as Shaq turned back to the kids, his silhouette bathed in the fading sun, the camera pulled back, rising slowly above the crowd, above the boutique, above the pulsing heart of the city. From this height, Shaq's shadow stretched long, not just across the pavement, but across the spirit of the place, larger than fame, larger than fortune, larger even than the man himself. It stood as a monument to justice, to resilience, to the idea that true legacy isn't measured in dollars or trophies, but in the hands you lift, the doors you open, the lives you touch. And as the city hummed below, the world tilted a little more toward the kind of change that lasts, the kind that begins not with anger, but with a giant's quiet, unshakable grace. What would you do if the world told you that you didn't belong in the very space you built? Let Shaq's story remind you. Real change starts when we stand up, not just for ourselves, but for each other. Carry this moment into your own life, challenge the assumptions, break the silence, and open the door for someone else. Because the true legacy we leave behind isn't measured by what we own, but by who we lift along the way.